The sun was setting on Pine Grove Avenue when Officer Richard Wilson noticed a blue minivan roll through a stop sign. It was just another routine traffic stop in his 15 years on the force, or at least that's what he thought. He flipped on his lights and followed the vehicle, watching as it pulled over smoothly to the curb near the local children's hospital. Through his tinted windows, Wilson could make out two young figures in the front seats. As he approached the vehicle, his hand instinctively moved to rest on his holster, a habit he developed over years of what he called street smarts, but what was really something far more troubling. The driver's window rolled down, revealing two identical faces looking back at him. Twin brothers, probably 16 or 17, wearing matching blue volunteer shirts from the children's hospital. The one behind the wheel had a name tag that read Alex, while his brother's tag showed Chris. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Wilson's voice came out harder than necessary, his words sharp and clipped. He'd seen too many young black men in nice cars lately, and something about it always set him on edge. The fact that these were clearly just teenagers didn't seem to register in his mind. "Yes, sir," Alex replied, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. "I apologize for not making a complete stop. We just finished our volunteer shift, and our mom texted that she's not feeling well. We were trying to get home quickly to check on her." Chris reached for his phone in the cup holder, probably to show the text message, but Wilson's reaction was immediate and excessive. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, pulling his flashlight out and shining it directly in Chris's face. "Sir, I was just—" Chris started to explain, his voice trembling slightly. "Out of the vehicle, both of you," Wilson commanded, stepping back and widening his stance. "Keep your hands visible and exit slowly." The twins exchanged a quick glance, years of conversations with their parents about how to handle police encounters running through their minds. They did exactly as they were told, moving with deliberate slowness, hands raised slightly at shoulder level. The evening air was cool, and a light breeze carried the antiseptic smell from the hospital across the street. Other cars passed by slowly, their drivers rubbernecking at the scene unfolding before them. A few hospital staff members had paused on their way to the parking lot, watching with concerned expressions. "Up against the car, both of you," Wilson ordered, his voice gruff with unwarranted suspicion. The twins complied, placing their palms flat against their minivan's cool metal surface. The volunteer badges on their shirts caught the last rays of sunlight, a bitter irony considering they'd just spent the last 4 hours reading stories to sick children and helping distribute dinner trays to patients. As Wilson roughly patted them down, he ignored their attempts to explain about their mother, about their volunteer work, about the completely clean record their car and licenses would show. His prejudice had painted a picture in his mind that no amount of evidence seemed able to erase. He reached for his handcuffs, the metal clicking ominously in the growing darkness. "We're going to have to run a full check on this vehicle," he announced, though there was absolutely no probable cause for such a search. "Something just doesn't add up here." What Wilson didn't realize was that fate was about to throw an unexpected twist into his evening, one that would force him to confront his own biases in the most dramatic way possible. As he moved to cuff Alex's wrists behind his back, he had no idea that in less than 10 minutes his entire world would be turned upside down, and these two young men he was treating so unfairly would become the only thing standing between him and disaster. The setting sun cast long shadows across the scene, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, an oddly fitting soundtrack for the life-changing moments that were about to unfold. Officer Wilson's fingers wrapped tightly around the cold metal handcuffs as he moved toward Alex. His face was set in stone, ignoring the confused and frightened looks from people walking by. Some hospital workers had stopped to watch, their scrubs visible in the dimming light, but Wilson paid them no attention. In his mind, he'd already decided what kind of people these two young men were. "Sir, please," Chris tried one more time, his voice steady despite his fear. "We can show you our volunteer badges. We've been helping out at the children's ward for over a year now." But Wilson wasn't listening. He yanked Alex's arms behind his back, the handcuffs clicking shut with a sound that echoed in the quiet evening air. The wind carried the smell of fresh rain and hospital disinfectant as Wilson roughly pushed Alex against the car. Chris watched helplessly as his brother winced, their mother's worried text messages still unanswered on their phones. They'd spent the afternoon bringing smiles to sick children's faces, reading stories, and helping wherever they could. Now here they were, being treated like criminals for nothing more than driving while black. "You boys think those volunteer shirts make you special?" Wilson sneered, reaching for his second pair of handcuffs. "I've seen all kinds of tricks. For all I know, those shirts are stolen." His words dripped with years of unchecked prejudice, each syllable a sharp reminder of the unfairness they were facing. A small crowd had gathered now. An elderly woman clutched her purse, watching with disapproval, though whether at the officer's behavior or the twins, it wasn't clear. A young nurse in blue scrubs had pulled out her phone, quietly recording the scene. Wilson noticed none of this, too caught up in his own assumptions and bias. Chris felt the cool nettle touch his wrists as Wilson moved to handcuff him next. Through the window of their minivan, he could see their volunteer name tags lying on the front seats. Just hours ago, they'd been using those same hands to help a young cancer patient build a Lego set, bringing a rare smile to the boy's tired face. "I'm going to search this vehicle," Wilson announced, his voice hard with unearned authority. "And when I find what I'm looking for." He left the threat hanging in the air, but the twins knew exactly what he meant. He was looking for something, anything, to justify his prejudiced actions. The frustration and fear built up in Chris's chest as he watched Wilson circle their family's minivan like a predator. This was the car their mom had worked extra shifts to buy. The car they used to drive elderly neighbors to doctor's appointments. The car that just that morning had been filled with donated books for the children's hospital. Alex stood silently, his face a mask of calm that Chris knew was hiding a storm of emotions underneath. They'd been taught how to handle situations like this: stay calm, don't argue, live to fight another day. But knowing what to do didn't make it any easier to bear. Wilson was reaching for his radio, probably to call for backup, when something unexpected happened. His hand suddenly froze halfway to his shoulder. A look of confusion crossed his face, followed quickly by something else, something that would change the course of the evening in ways none of them could have predicted. The sun had almost completely set now, casting long shadows across the scene. The hospital's lights flickered on, creating a harsh contrast against the darkening sky. In the distance, a siren wailed, but it wasn't coming for them. Not yet, anyway. In just a few moments, everything would change, and Officer Wilson would learn a lesson about prejudice and humanity that no training manual could ever teach. The air grew thick with tension as Wilson's breathing became labored, his face contorting in a way that had nothing to do with his usual stern expression. The twins noticed the change immediately, their own discomfort momentarily forgotten as they watched the officer who'd been so cruel just seconds ago begin to struggle with something far more serious than his own prejudice. Officer Wilson's face suddenly turned pale as paper. His right hand clutched at his chest, fingers digging into his uniform. The stern look that had dominated his features just moments ago melted into pure fear as he stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. I can't," he wheezed, his legs giving way beneath him. The flashlight dropped from his hand, clattering on the pavement as he collapsed against his patrol car. His eyes, which had been so full of judgment just moments before, now widened with panic. The twins, still handcuffed, watched in shock as the officer slid down the side of the car onto the cold ground. The same man who'd been ready to ruin their lives minutes ago was now fighting for his own. Sweat beaded on Wilson's forehead despite the cool evening air, and his face had taken on a sickly gray color. "Help!" Wilson managed to gasp, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please." The words seemed to cost him tremendous effort. His left arm tingled with numbness, and the crushing pain in his chest intensified. Here he was, at the mercy of two young men he just treated with nothing but contempt and suspicion. The small crowd of onlookers stood frozen, unsure what to do. The nurse who'd been recording pulled her phone down slowly, her medical training telling her exactly what was happening: a massive heart attack. But before she could move, she saw something extraordinary unfold before her eyes. Alex turned to his brother, their eyes meeting in silent communication. Despite their situation, despite the handcuffs still biting into their wrists, they both knew what they had to do. They'd spent too many hours at the hospital, learned too much about helping others, to simply stand by and watch anyone suffer, even someone who'd shown them nothing but prejudice. "Sir," Alex called out, his voice calm and clear, "we need the handcuff keys. Right pocket of your belt, isn't it? We can help you, but you need to trust us. Wilson's eyes, clouded with pain and fear, met Alex's. For a moment, the officer hesitated, years of ingrained bias warring with his desperate need for help. With trembling fingers, Wilson managed to reach for his belt, fumbling for the keys. Chris carefully knelt beside him, turning so the officer could reach the handcuffs. The metal clanked as first one brother, then the other was freed. Every second felt like an eternity as Wilson's breathing became more labored. "I'm calling 911. A voice called from the crowd, but the twins were already in motion. Their volunteer training kicked in automatically. While Chris grabbed the officer's radio to call for emergency medical services, Alex knelt beside Wilson, his earlier fear replaced by focused determination. "Sir, I need you to try to stay calm," Alex said, his voice steady as he loosened Wilson's collar and tie. "We're going to help you through this." The officer's eyes, now filled with a mixture of pain and dawning realization, locked onto Alex's face. Gone was the threatening authority figure from minutes ago. Now he was just a frightened human being in desperate need of help. The sun had fully set now, and the hospital's bright lights cast harsh shadows across the scene. The same parking lot where Wilson had profiled and handcuffed two innocent teenagers was about to become the place where those same teenagers would fight to save his life. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. Chris returned from the radio, dropping to his knees beside his brother. "Help is coming," he reported, his voice tight with concentration. "But there's still 4 minutes out." He looked at his brother, both of them knowing that in a heart attack, 4 minutes could be an eternity. Their extensive time volunteering in the hospital had taught them that much. Wilson's eyes began to flutter, his consciousness fading. The twins exchanged another quick look, knowing they were about to put all their hospital volunteer training to the ultimate test. The next few minutes would determine not just Officer Wilson's fate, but perhaps something much bigger. A chance to show that compassion could overcome prejudice, that humanity could triumph over hate. "He's not breathing," Chris called out, his fingers pressed against Wilson's neck. The officer's pulse was weak and irregular, his skin clammy to the touch. The crowd around them had grown larger, their faces illuminated by the harsh parking lot lights. Alex quickly moved into position, remembering every detail from their hospital training. "Starting chest compressions," he announced, placing his hands in the center of Wilson's chest. The same hands that Wilson had so roughly cuffed minutes ago were now fighting to keep him alive. The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. 1, 2, 3, 4. Alex counted silently, maintaining the steady rhythm they'd practiced so many times on training dummies. But this was different. This was real. He could feel the officer's ribs beneath his hands, could hear the desperate gasps for air. "Where's the nearest AED?" Chris asked the crowd, his eyes scanning the hospital entrance. A security guard who had just arrived pointed toward the building's main doors. "I'll get it," he shouted, already running. Time was precious now. Every second counted. The nurse who had been recording earlier knelt down beside them, offering her help. "I'm a cardiac nurse," she said, her voice steady and professional. "Keep going, you're doing great." She helped tilt Wilson's head back, maintaining his airway while Alex continued compressions. Chris returned moments later, the AED in his hands. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened the device. They trained with these, but never in a situation this intense. The nurse helped them attach the pads to Wilson's chest, her movements quick and precise. "Clear," she called out. Everyone moved back as the device analyzed Wilson's heart rhythm. The parking lot fell silent except for the mechanical voice of the AED. "Shock advised. Stand clear." The button flashed, and Wilson's body jerked as the electrical current passed through him. Alex immediately resumed compressions. Sweat dripped down his face as he pushed hard and fast against Wilson's chest. The same officer who had profiled them, who had treated them like criminals, now depended entirely on their help. But there was no hesitation in Alex's movements, no trace of resentment in his actions. "Come on, officer," Chris encouraged, watching his brother work. "Stay with us." In the distance, sirens grew louder. Help was coming, but they had to keep him alive until then. The crowd watched in tense silence, witnesses to this powerful moment of humanity overcoming prejudice. Wilson's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused but conscious. He tried to speak, but no words came out. The look in his eyes had changed completely, the previous hardness replaced by something like understanding, maybe even shame. Here he was, his life in the hands of two young men he had wrongly judged. The nurse checked his pulse again. "It's stronger," she reported, just as the ambulance pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing. The paramedics rushed over with their equipment, ready to take over. But before they did, Wilson's hand weakly grabbed Alex's wrist. "Thank you," he managed to whisper, his eyes filling with tears. The words seemed to carry the weight of more than just gratitude. They held an apology, a recognition of his mistake, a promise to do better. As the paramedics took over, the twins stepped back, their shoulders heavy with exhaustion. The crowd that had gathered began to applaud spontaneously, moved by what they had witnessed. But Alex and Chris weren't focused on the applause. They watched as Wilson was loaded into the ambulance, both of them silently praying he would survive. A police sergeant who had arrived on scene approached them, his face serious but kind. "You boys just saved his life," he said quietly, "and maybe changed it too." He looked at their volunteer shirts, now wrinkled and sweaty from their efforts. "Your parents must be very proud." The mention of their parents suddenly reminded them. Their mother was still waiting at home, probably worried sick. But somehow, they knew she would understand when they told her what had happened. After all, she was the one who had taught them that every life has value, regardless of how someone treats you. In the chaos following Officer Wilson's heart attack, the hospital parking lot buzzed with activity. Red and blue lights from police cars and the ambulance painted the scene in alternating colors. The twins stood to the side, their volunteer shirts now wrinkled and damp with sweat from their life-saving efforts. "You boys need to come to the hospital to give a statement," the police sergeant said, his tone much gentler than Wilson's had been earlier. "We'll need to document everything that happened." He paused, looking uncomfortable, including the initial traffic stop. The nurse who had helped them stepped forward. "I have video of the whole thing," she said firmly, "from the moment he pulled them over. These boys did nothing wrong, and then they saved his life." Her phone was still in her hand, the evidence safely recorded. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, but not before several people came up to shake the twins' hands. An elderly man wiped tears from his eyes as he patted Chris on the shoulder. "I saw the whole thing," he said, his voice shaking. "You boys showed us what real character looks like." At the hospital, the emergency room was a flurry of activity as doctors worked on Wilson. The twins sat in the waiting room, finally able to call their mother. Their hands trembled as they dialed, the adrenaline from the events finally wearing off. "Mom," Alex said when she answered, his voice cracking slightly. "We're okay, but we're at the hospital." He could hear the panic in her breathing and quickly added, not as patience, We helped save someone's life." As they took turns explaining what happened, their mother's silence spoke volumes. The police sergeant returned with cups of hot chocolate for them both. "Officer Wilson is stable," he announced. "The doctors say if you hadn't started CPR when you did." He left the sentence unfinished, but they all understood. Those precious minutes of chest compressions had made all the difference. A young doctor emerged from the emergency room, still wearing his surgical cap. He looked at the twins with admiration. "Your quick action and proper CPR technique kept oxygen flowing to his brain," he explained. "We don't always see such quality compressions, even from trained professionals. Where did you learn that?" Chris gestured to their volunteer badges. "We've been volunteering here for over a year," he said quietly. "The head nurse taught us CPR and made sure we practiced until we got it perfect." The doctor nodded, impressed. More officers had arrived at the hospital, gathering in small groups and talking in hushed tones. Word had spread quickly about what happened, about how two young black teenagers, wrongly profiled and handcuffed, had chosen to save the life of the officer who had mistreated them. A reporter from the local news had shown up too, eager to cover the story. But the twins declined to be interviewed. This wasn't about publicity or praise. It was about doing what was right, about rising above prejudice and choosing compassion over resentment. The nurse who had recorded everything approached them again. "I sent the video to the police chief," she said softly. "He needs to see how this started and how it ended. Things need to change." The twins nodded, hoping that their experience might help prevent someone else from going through the same thing. As the night wore on, doctors continued to monitor Wilson's condition. The twins remained at the hospital, unable to leave until they knew he would be okay. Their mother arrived, wrapping them both in a tight hug, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and pain. Pride in their actions, pain that they had faced such injustice in the first place. "You did the right thing," she whispered, holding them close. "You showed him that character isn't about the color of your skin. It's about what's in your heart." The twins hugged her back, exhausted but knowing that their actions tonight might have changed more than just one life. 2 days passed since that eventful night in the hospital parking lot. Officer Wilson lay in his hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines and the steady drip of IV fluids. The cardiac wing was quiet except for the soft footsteps of nurses making their rounds. The morning light filtered through the window when there was a gentle knock on his door. Wilson turned his head, expecting another nurse, but instead found himself looking at the 2 young men he'd wrongly judged that night. They stood in the doorway, still wearing their volunteer shirts, carrying a small plant. "The kids in the cancer ward helped us pick this out," Alex said softly, placing the colorful potted flower on the windowsill. "They wanted to send their get-well wishes too." The same children Wilson had assumed they'd stolen their volunteer shirts for had spent the morning decorating the pot with cheerful stickers. Wilson's eyes filled with tears as he looked at them. The oxygen tube under his nose made it hard to speak, but he managed to whisper, "I don't deserve your kindness." His hands, now free of the handcuffs he'd so quickly reached for that night, trembled as he gestured for them to come closer. Chris pulled up a chair while Alex remained standing. The tension from that night was gone, replaced by something more complex, not quite forgiveness, but a shared understanding of how close things had come to ending very differently. "The doctor says you'll make a full recovery," Chris said, his voice steady. "But you'll need to make some changes. Less stress, better diet, regular exercise." He smiled slightly. "The cardiac rehab team here is excellent. We help out there sometimes too." Wilson nodded, then took a shaky breath. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About that night. About how I treated you. About how you saved my life anyway." He paused, gathering strength. "I've been a cop for 15 years, and I've been wrong for 15 years. The twins listened quietly as Wilson continued. "I let fear and prejudice guide my actions. I saw your skin color and made assumptions that said more about me than about you." His heart monitor beeped steadily in the background. "I could have ruined your lives that night. Instead, you saved mine." A nurse passed by the room, doing a double take at seeing the 2 volunteers sitting with their former arresting officer. Word had spread through the hospital about what happened that night. The story had touched everyone who heard it. A powerful reminder that compassion could overcome hate. "We've been thinking too," Alex said after a moment, "about how things could change." The police chief watched the video of that night. He wants to start a new training program. He looked at Wilson carefully. "He thinks your experience could help other officers understand their own biases." Wilson's eyes widened slightly. "You'd be willing to help with that?" "After what I did." The surprise in his voice was clear. The thought that these young men would not only save his life, but also help him make meaningful change seemed almost too much to accept. Chris leaned forward in his chair. "Change has to start somewhere," he said simply. "What happened that night was wrong, but maybe it can lead to something right." He gestured around the hospital room. "We volunteer here because we believe in helping people, all people, even those who've hurt us." The morning sun had risen higher, casting warm light across the room. The little plant on the windowsill cast a shadow on the wall, its leaves gently moving in the breeze from the air conditioning. In this quiet moment, something profound was happening. Barriers were breaking down, understanding was growing, and hope was taking root. Wilson reached out his hand, no longer as the authoritative officer who had wrongly judged them, but as a humbled man who had learned the hardest lesson of his life in the most powerful way possible. The twins looked at each other for a moment, then each took turns shaking his hand. A week after Officer Wilson's heart attack, the hospital conference room was packed with police officers, medical staff, and community members. The police chief stood at the podium, his face serious as he addressed the crowd. Behind him, a large screen displayed a still image from the video taken that night. "What you're about to see isn't easy to watch," the chief began, his voice firm. "But it's something we need to see." He nodded to someone in the back, and the video began to play. The room fell silent as they watched the events unfold: the unfair traffic stop, the harassment, the handcuffs, and then the dramatic turn of events. In the front row, the twins sat with their mother, watching as their story played out on the screen. Next to them, Officer Wilson sat in a wheelchair, still recovering but determined to be present. His face showed the pain of watching his own actions, seeing himself through new eyes. When the video ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The chief returned to the podium, clearing his throat. "This could have ended in tragedy," he said. Instead, it became a powerful lesson about prejudice, compassion, and the chance for real change. Wilson slowly stood up from his wheelchair, leaning slightly on the podium for support. His voice was stronger now as he addressed his fellow officers. "I was wrong," he said simply. "For years, I let fear and bias control my actions. I stopped seeing people as people. Instead, I saw threats that didn't exist." He turned to look at the twins. "These young men had every right to let me die that night. I had just finished humiliating them, treating them like criminals when they'd done nothing wrong." His voice cracked slightly. "But they chose to save my life. They showed me what real character looks like." The nurse who had recorded the video stood up next. "I've worked in this hospital for 12 years, she said. "I've watched these boys volunteer countless hours, helping our patients, learning medical skills, making a difference. That night, they used those skills to save someone who had just finished treating them like criminals." The police chief announced new training programs, focusing on recognizing and overcoming racial bias. But more importantly, he announced a new partnership with the hospital's volunteer program. Officers would spend time working alongside volunteers, getting to know the community they served as people, not suspects. Alex and Chris shared their story next, speaking not with anger but with hope. They talked about their volunteer work, about the joy of helping others, and about their belief that change was possible. The room listened in respectful silence, many officers taking notes, others nodding in understanding. "We didn't save Officer Wilson's life because we wanted recognition," Chris explained. "We did it because it was right, because every life has value regardless of how someone has treated you." Alex added, "And maybe, just maybe, this can be the start of real change." The meeting ended with something unexpected. Officer Wilson, still weak but standing tall, removed his badge. He walked slowly to where the twins sat and held it out to them. "This badge is supposed to represent protection and service," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet room. "You've shown me what that really means." The twins looked at the badge, then at each other. After a moment, they gently pushed his hand back. "Keep it," Alex said softly. "Use it to protect and serve the right way now." Chris nodded in agreement. "Your badge isn't just a piece of metal, it's a promise to the community. A promise you can still keep." The room burst into applause, not the polite kind that ends meetings, but the genuine kind that acknowledges a moment of real transformation. As people began to stand, many were wiping tears from their eyes, moved by what they had witnessed. This wasn't just about one officer and two young men anymore. It was about the possibility of change, about choosing compassion over hatred, understanding over fear. It was about seeing the humanity in each other, even in the hardest moments. 3 months had passed since that life-changing night in the hospital parking lot. The autumn leaves were falling as Officer Wilson walked into the children's ward, no longer in his police uniform but wearing casual clothes. He carried a box of books and toys, following the twins as they made their regular volunteer rounds. The transformation in Wilson was remarkable. Gone was the harsh, suspicious officer who had once handcuffed 2 innocent teenagers. In his place was a man who had learned humility, compassion, and the true meaning of service. His heart attack had healed, but the real healing had happened in his mind and soul. Story time. Alex called out as they entered the pediatric cancer ward. Small faces lit up with excitement as children gathered around. Some walked slowly, pulling IV poles behind them, while others were wheeled in by nurses. Wilson watched in amazement as the twins, who he had once treated with such suspicion, brought pure joy to these sick children. "Officer Will," a small girl called out, recognizing him from his previous visits. She patted the space next to her bed, inviting him to sit. 3 months ago, he would have felt uncomfortable, out of place. Now he sat down without hesitation, pulling a colorful book from his box. While Wilson read to the children, making funny voices that filled the room with giggles, the twins organized medicine schedules with the nurses. They moved with confidence and purpose, their volunteer work having evolved into something even more meaningful since that fateful night. The police department had changed too. The new training program, inspired by what happened that night, was making a real difference. Officers now spent time volunteering at the hospital, breaking down barriers and building trust with the community. Wilson had become its strongest advocate, sharing his story with every new recruit. "Remember when you first came here?" Chris asked Wilson during a quiet moment. "You were so nervous." Wilson nodded, remembering his first visit after leaving the hospital. He had felt shame, guilt, and fear, emotions that the children's pure acceptance had helped him overcome. The nurse who had recorded the video that night passed by, smiling at the scene. She had become a regular part of their story, helping to train officers in basic medical response and teaching them about the community they served. Her video had become a powerful teaching tool, showing both the worst and the best of human nature. Later that afternoon, Wilson joined the twins in the hospital cafeteria. They had made this a weekly tradition, sharing lunch, talking about changes in the police department, and planning new ways to bring the community together. Their story had inspired others, showing that transformation was possible. "My daughter asked me something interesting yesterday," Wilson said, stirring his coffee. "She asked if I was scared that night when I was having the heart attack." He looked at the twins thoughtfully. "I told her I was terrified, but not just of dying. I was terrified of dying knowing that my last act would have been one of prejudice and cruelty." Alex and Chris listened quietly. They had heard parts of this before, but each time Wilson shared his thoughts, there was new understanding, new depth to his transformation. "But you gave me more than just life," he continued. "You gave me a chance to change, to make things right." Outside the cafeteria windows, police cars and ambulances passed by, their sirens silent. Inside, 3 people who should have been enemies sat together as friends, their story a testament to the power of compassion over hate, of understanding over fear. "The kids want you to come to their talent show next week," Chris mentioned, changing the subject. "They're doing a play about everyday heroes." He smiled slightly. "No pressure, but they might have written you a part." Wilson's eyes lit up, and for a moment, the hardened police officer was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to see the world through new eyes. 1 year had passed since that fateful night in the hospital parking lot. The community center was packed with people, police officers, hospital staff, local residents, and countless children from the pediatric ward who were well enough to attend. They had all gathered for something special, the first anniversary of the Community Bridge program. Officer Wilson stood at the podium, looking out at the faces before him. He wasn't in uniform today, but wore a blue volunteer shirt matching the ones the twins had worn that night. "A year ago," he began, his voice strong and clear, "I was a different person. I was an officer who had forgotten the true meaning of protect and serve." In the front row, the twins sat with their mother, who now served as a coordinator between the police department and the hospital's volunteer program. Next to them were several officers who had gone through the new training program, each wearing the same volunteer shirts. "These 2 young men didn't just save my life," Wilson continued, gesturing to the twins. "They started a movement." He clicked a button, and behind him, images began to play on a large screen. Officers reading to sick children, police cadets learning CPR from hospital staff, community members and law enforcement working side by side. The statistics told a powerful story. Complaints against officers had dropped by 60%. Community trust had risen dramatically. The hospital's volunteer program had tripled in size, with police officers making up many of the new volunteers. But the numbers weren't what mattered most, it was the changed hearts and minds. "Last week," Wilson shared, "I pulled over a young driver for speeding. The room grew quiet. But instead of approaching with suspicion, I asked if everything was okay. Turns out he was rushing his pregnant sister to the hospital." Wilson smiled. "I turned on my lights and led them there myself. That's what protecting and serving really means." Alex and Chris took the stage next, no longer the frightened teenagers in handcuffs, but confident young men who had turned a moment of injustice into lasting change. They shared stories of officers who now volunteered regularly in the children's ward, of barriers broken down, of trust being rebuilt one small action at a time. Change doesn't always come from big moments, Chris explained. Sometimes it comes from small choices, from seeing each other as human beings, from choosing compassion over fear. Alex added, "We didn't know it that night, but saving one life would end up changing hundreds more." The police chief stepped up next, holding a special commendation, but instead of presenting it to the twins, he turned to the audience. "This award belongs to all of us," he announced. "To every officer who learned to see differently. To every community member who gave us a chance to change. To every child in the hospital who showed us what unconditional acceptance looks like." As the ceremony ended, something remarkable happened. The children from the hospital's cancer ward, led by the little girl who had first welcomed Wilson to story time, presented him and the twins with hand-drawn pictures. Each one showed police officers and community members together, the way the children now saw them, not as separate groups, but as one community. Wilson gathered with the twins for photos, his arm around their shoulders, all three smiling genuinely. The nurse who had recorded the video that night watched from the side, her phone in her hand, but this time she wasn't recording injustice, she was capturing triumph. "Some people call it a miracle," Wilson said later as they shared cake and coffee. "But it wasn't. It was a choice. A choice to see past prejudice. A choice to help someone who had wronged you. A choice to believe that people can change." He looked at the twins with deep respect. "You made that choice in seconds. It's taken me a year to fully understand what that means." As the sun set outside the community center, casting long shadows through the windows, the room remained full of people talking, laughing, and sharing stories. This wasn't just a celebration of what had happened 1 year ago. It was a promise to keep choosing compassion, understanding, and hope one day at a time.